It's the fish that changed the views of a generation about the ocean. The Oscar-winning animated movie Finding Nemo was a box office smash and became one of the best-selling DVDs of all time. Iconic, cheeky, lovable. Since its release, kids across the planet have wanted their own Nemo. But at what cost? To feed the demand, this year, clownfish worth millions of dollars will be taken from the sea. Has the film put its star in danger on the reef? It's been discovered that as well as through fishing, the clownfish has become victim of other, more insidious, though less apparent threats. As stocks of the fish in the wild have been driven to dangerously low levels, a new clownfish farming industry has evolved to supply the continuing demand. And the sudden popularity of the fish has put it under the spotlight of intense scientific study, with some intriguing and totally unexpected conclusions. So, are the pressures of the 21st century just too great? Is there a future for the fish that has inspired a whole generation? Or is it already too late? Instead of finding Nemo, should we now be thinking of saving the film star fish? Meet the clownfish, so called because of its classic circus clown coloration and how it appears to clown around on the reef. It's scientifically known as Amphibrion percula, but thanks to the success of the movie, it's become one of the most famous and best recognized fish in the ocean. The clownfish is just one member of a family of almost 30 different species known as anemone fish, having in common that they live among the venomous tentacles of sea anemones. There are around 1,000 species of anemones. They're found from the coldest polar waters to the equator. But of that 1,000, only 10 act as hosts to anemone fish. And these are all found in the warm, shallow waters of the Indo-Pacific Ocean, from the east coast of Africa to Hawaii. Sea anemones have stinging cells that can kill fish that stray into them. But the anemone fish seem immune to their lethal hosts. The fish achieves this by smearing mucus from the anemone over itself. So, just as the anemone doesn't sting itself, it doesn't sting the fish. A sort of chemical camouflage. A fish in anemone's clothing. But despite all we know about them, there's still much that is not known about their lives. Trying to discover answers to the mysteries surrounding the clownfish are a research team from Australia's James Cook University, for whom the shallow seas of Papua New Guinea's Kimby Bay are the perfect oceanic laboratory. The scientists have selected a few coral bommies, and over the years have come to intimately know their residents. They carry out regular transects of these bommies, a type of undersea census of the population. Laying tapes at set levels, they keep an accurate tally of the numbers of varying species of corals and reef fish. In this way, they can identify and record fluctuations in the populations, recording both increases and decreases in numbers. Jeff Jones analyses the results from yet another day's work in the field, or in his case, the ocean. The team spend many months here every year gathering data, and Jeff is recognised as one of the planet's leading experts in clownfish. He He's conducting long-term research into the missing link in the life cycle of these enigmatic fish. What happens between hatching and the young settling onto an anemone. It's been thought till now that the larvae simply disperse in the plankton, and it was a random 1 in a million chance that eventually some find an anemone on which to settle. In fact, the truth is far more complex. Anemone fish form permanent bonds that last for life. When the female's ready to lay her eggs, both she and the male prepare the nest by cleaning a small, hard area under the shelter of the anemone. Once the eggs are laid, throughout incubation, the male meticulously guards them. The fish also regularly fan the eggs with their pectoral fins to ensure that a permanent flow of clean, oxygenated water passes over them. When the eggs hatch, the larvae are released into the plankton. After a further 10 days, juvenile, fully formed babies settle onto an anemone. But the mystery for scientists has been that gap, when they're in the plankton, between hatching and finding a home.
Yeah, we're actually using Nemo to answer one of the oldest unanswered questions in marine biology, really, and that is, how far away do the juvenile fishes disperse away from the parents? The movie, I think, creates a nice little story of Nemo sitting there living on the anemone with his dad and one big happy family. But the reality is far from that. Most marine fishes, when those little eggs hatch, they hatch into these tiny little larvae, only a few millimetres long. They are then basically cast off from the family home. They're sent out into the hostile pelagic environment, and many people believed for a long time they're at the mercy of the currents. They'll disperse a long way away from their home. But nobody's been able to really get at this. You know, we've always suspected they go a long way, but they're so small, the idea of tagging them to figure out where they go has been, to some extent, the holy grail. We just have not had a way to do that until maybe the last 10 years.
Amazingly, the same tool of forensic science that's used to detect the grisliest of crimes could help them to discover this holy grail. Port Moresby Harbour, Papua New Guinea. Early morning, and the fish screeners are heading out to Fisherman's Island. It's little more than a sandbar, a narrow strip of land. At its highest, just a couple of meters above sea level. It used to be a fisherman's camp, but over the years has evolved into a busy little community where around 500 people exist from the sea. Until recently, their only source of income was selling their daily catch in the fish markets of the mainland. But over the past few years, the popularity of one of the residents of the shallow patch reef right outside their homes has brought them a new source of income. Harvesting live fish for the international aquarium market, where the demand for the film star fish seems insatiable. And this is all you need to become a professional reef fish collector. Mask and fins, a small net, and a homemade floating keep pot. A sinister shadow over the reef, and one more clownfish who won't be coming home. The divers must be careful not to damage the fish. A damaged fish will be worthless. And they also need to leave a breeding population on the anemone. so there'll be fish to harvest next time the diver visits this reef. In a day, a collector can hope to gather a fair crop of fish, a good supplement to their regular income from more traditional fishing. Most anemones are within the range of a freediver. That's because, like plants, anemones need sunshine. Living only in shallow water, within their tentacles are microscopic single-celled algae that, like all plants, photosynthesize, creating energy from the sunlight. In the Hollywood blockbuster, young Nemo strays too far from his home anemone, is netted by a scuba diver, and ends up in a tank in a dentist's surgery. His devoted father, helped by an ocean full of charismatic sea creatures, makes an epic journey to save and be reunited with his son. What's happening here is the exact same scenario from the film. But for these fish, it's the beginning of a chain that even Nemo's dedicated father couldn't hope to follow. The start of a very long journey by boat, road transport, and jet plane that will eventually end in a fish tank in someone's house somewhere in the United States. From the James Cook Research Base in Papua New Guinea's Kimby Bay, Professor Phil Munday reveals some intriguing facts about the lives of clownfish.
Anemone fish have quite an amazing social structure, a family hierarchy. It turns out that the largest individual in a social group is the female, the next one is the male, and those two breed together. And then there might be 3 or 4 other smaller individuals living in the same social group. Each one will be slightly smaller, a set amount smaller than the next one. And they maintain this social hierarchy all the way right through to the smallest individual in the group. And only the 2 largest ones breed, and all the other ones are in a queue waiting for a breeding opportunity. And if the male, for example, disappeared, then the next one in line would move up, take the male role, become mature and start breeding with the female.
While the female grows much larger than the males, the size hierarchy between the males is very precise. Each individual is about 90% of the size of the one above it. If one gets too close in size to the next one in the queue, he'll get evicted from the group. However, even more intriguing is what happens if the female is removed.
If the female disappears, if she dies from old age or if she's removed, then the male will actually change sex into a female, and then one of the sub-adults will mature and become a male, and of course everyone just shuffles up the queue.
All anemone fish, when they hatch, are born as males. But if the need arises, the dominant male can go through a total sex change and become a fully fertile female, able to lay eggs. These eggs are then fertilized by the next male in the social ladder. This is nature's way of ensuring the survival of the species. If it didn't occur, the males would have to leave the safety of the anemone to find a mate. And in the hostile ocean, few would survive the quest. At Fisherman's Island, the screening team and collectors are ready for the fish count. Anemone fish are territorial and will fight off intruders to their anemone. From experience, the fishers have learnt that putting several in one store pot will result in battles, which only end when there's a clear winner. And damaged fish will not sell. So the anemone fish are stored in individual pots. The assessors sort through the fish, keeping separate tallies for each collector. Every fish is carefully examined for blemishes. Any displaying injuries, disease, deformity, or just poor colouring are all weeded out. They've been trained what to look for, what's acceptable to the high demands of the aquarium trade on the other side of the world.
5 small shrimp clown, 3 medium.
Those that don't make the grade are discarded back into the sea. The fragile underwater world of Southeast Asia is a riot of colour and vibrancy. The ecosystem of the coral reef is a delicate balance, everything depending on everything else. Complex links exist, whereby the smallest to the largest of creatures are all reliant on each other, providing shelter, food, protection, and even cleaning services. But it doesn't take much to disturb this balance. The argument in favour of wild capture of fish is simple: that taking live fish for the aquarium trade is no worse than fishing for food. Just another sort of harvest of the sea. We catch huge quantities of fish to eat, so what does it matter if we take a few small fish from the reef? Back at the collection facility in Port Moresby, Mark is waiting for the arrival of the latest shipment from the island. He's well aware of the controversy surrounding the wild capture of fish.
Basically, we are establishing the aquarium trade here and working with fishing villages to provide them an alternative income, while at the same time teaching them the value of healthy reefs and maintaining healthy reefs around their villages.
But why is it necessary to take fish from the wild?
The marine aquarium hobby, there's a very small percentage of aquarium fish that are being raised in captivity. That number is growing. However, the demand for fish, especially clownfish like Nemo, is very high, and the current rate of production cannot meet the demand. So there's still a pretty significant demand for wild-caught fish.
And it's not just clownfish that are in demand. Other characters from the film are also taken from the wild. Blue tangs, Dory in the film, are particular favourites.
Well, the aquarium fish fishery is just another natural resource. It's another fishery, and can be a very important source of alternative income for island countries, developing countries, where the resource, or where the only resource they have is the sea.
With true clownfish coming from a very limited geographic range, it's a fishery clearly very vulnerable to overexploitation. This is particularly so in communities living from subsistence-level fishing, who may see this new source of income as the equivalent of winning the lottery. Catch today and take tomorrow when it comes.
Certainly, aquarium fish collection in the wild can be very harmful. In our program, we conduct extensive surveys prior to any collection to determine approximate estimates of the wild stocks. Then every species has a catch limit, an annual catch limit, and reefs are surveyed annually or every 18 months or 24 months to determine what the impact of our collection has had. If necessary, catch limits are readjusted, and our hope is that over the course of 5 years, we'll be able to determine that aquarium fish collection has had a minimal impact on the coral reefs.
Opponents of the programme feel that by the time the impact's been determined, the damage may already have been done, and stocks in the wild could have been reduced to critical levels. The fish that were collected this morning are now back at the facility and find themselves in an alien environment. In these clinical surroundings, the fish are graded by size and are quarantined for a week or 10 days before shipping to the lucrative markets of the west coast of the United States, a 4,000-mile, 14-hour plane ride away. Papua New Guinea is one of the planet's final frontiers. And the seas surrounding Papua New Guinea are the richest region of the world's oceans for numbers and diversity of undersea life. Remote coral mountains reach from the deep to close under the surface, and they thrive with life. Far from population concentrations, and so far spared the worst of overfishing and pollution, this ocean is as close as it gets to how it all once was before man made his mark. In these seas are also the greatest variety of anemone fish to be found, often several different species on the same reef. Symbiosis is when two very different species coexist, and both receive a benefit from the other. The anemone fish gains a great deal from its relationship with the anemone. It gets protection from predators. Nothing will pursue the fish into its venom-protected haven among the anemone's lethal tentacles. And it's also provided with a totally safe nursery in which to lay and nurture its eggs until the tiny replicas are ready to hatch. But does the anemone gain anything in return? Experiments on the reef have shown that anemone fish provide essential protection to the anemone. When the fish have been removed, within 24 hours the anemone had completely disappeared, eaten by predators. So take away the fish, and the anemone itself is in mortal peril. These small but aggressive fish chase away any other fish that's looking to feed off the anemone. So the one just cannot survive without the other. A comfortable balance until man is thrown into the equation. The fish aren't the only undersea creatures to live among the protective tentacles of the anemone. Black damselfish hover close by. Porcelain crabs live out their lives in the safety of their anemone home. Shrimp also live in a symbiotic relationship with the anemone. The shrimp feed on parasites and particles that settle on the anemone's tentacles, keeping their host clean and free of disease. It's like a constant cleaning service as they graze on the anemone, ensuring its health. Sometimes the anemone seems like an overcrowded housing project, with dozens of shrimp sharing the anemone with the fish. But it's an easy relationship. The shrimp aren't part of the fish's diet, so they coexist comfortably, both enjoying the protected home that the anemone provides. And with the shrimps keeping it clean and free from parasites, and the fish defending it from attackers, the anemone also benefits. Some are thought to live for several decades, if not even longer. The problem faced by the scientists was how to establish where tiny, newly hatched anemone fish disappear to in the days before they settle on the reef. The starting point was to log the location of every single anemone on a GPS database. Then every fish on each anemone is measured and photographed. Initially, the team injected a stable barium isotope into each fish. That way, when the parents passed that on to their young, it could be ascertained from which pair of fish the hatchlings came. One drawback to this method was that to establish this information, it was necessary to kill and dissect the young fish. So the researchers turned to a tool of forensic science, more commonly used to detect crimes.
It then dawned on us that there was another way to do this. With the developments in genetics, we realised that the mother and the father were always tagging their offspring. The mother and the father have a unique DNA sequences. They combine these in their juveniles, and we found that by sampling a small amount of the fin of both the mother and the father and sampling all the adults in a population, we could then find the juveniles, and we could use the DNA to work out exactly where their parents were and exactly how far they've moved away from their parents. And this is the first time it's given us like an exact dispersal distance that a juvenile fish has travelled.
This doesn't mean that all the clownfish swimming around the island have deformed tails. The fish don't seem bothered in any way, and the thin slice taken from the fin grows back quickly. So DNA sampling is applied to good effect by the scientists to uncover a true mystery of the ocean.
If 100 fish can be bred in the farms, that 100 fish will save the fish from the wild.
This is the motto of Professor Vorothat Muthuwan, director of the Institute of Marine Science in Chonburi, an hour's drive south of Bangkok. His work on the captive breeding of clownfish over the past decade has spawned a whole fish farming industry in the south of Thailand.
Most of the fish, they are fish from the wild. Okay, that can, damage the reef ecosystem too. And then what we think that is possible that we can find some of the alternative by culturing the fish in the farm to replenish or to reduce the pressure on the coral reef.
Vorothat's work is prompted by what he perceives as a high risk of damage to the marine ecosystem from the increasing trade in wild-caught fish. Clownfish are one of the few reef fishes that can be successfully captive bred. However, every stage of the process has been the result of trial and error. In the wild, fish lay their eggs in the shelter of their anemone, finding a hard, secure surface for the eggs to attach to. In the laboratory, the best substitute has been found to be a floor tile. Breeding pairs are kept isolated in tanks. The female deposits the eggs, making a wiggling pass over the surface. Then the male follows behind her, fertilizing the eggs. After many passes, the nest is complete. Sometimes there can be hundreds of eggs. It can take between 6 and 8 days for the eggs to hatch. These pairs are Vorithep's breeding stock, the foundation on which his whole project rests. All the fish are captive bred, going back many generations, ensuring that he can guarantee that the program works. No new stock has been introduced from the wild for many years. Sample eggs are taken from every batch and carefully inspected. The huge eye of the embryonic clownfish can be seen through the microscope. When the eggs hatch, each brood is kept in separate tanks and monitored as they grow. The university team also experiments to find the best food to nourish the fish at every stage of development. All this food is bred and produced here to simulate as closely as possible the diet the fish would be eating in the ocean. A bubbling brew of plant phytoplankton for the tiny hatchlings, and a soup of zooplankton made up of crustaceans to feed the young fish. It's a successful cycle that he's repeated numerous times, from egg to hatchling to fully mature adults laying the next generation of eggs. The James Cook team have found the ideal location for their studies. A tiny, uninhabited island a long way from any centres of population, from the effects of pollution, and too far from land to be affected by fishing. The perfect mid-oceanic bubble in which to conduct their research.
Here we are at Kimby Island, just a drop in the ocean really, just a tiny little island. You can swim around it in half an hour or so, and you can see it's covered in lush tropical rainforest. It's actually overhanging some of the nice coral reef right around the fringing reef. So my research team's really been coming here for the last 10 years or so studying the clownfish populations here. There's about, I guess it's something like 300 breeding pairs of the orange clownfish, Nemo, here, and a lot of them are actually in and along. You can see they're actually, where the trees are overhanging, they're actually living underneath. So if they actually look up, they can actually see trees.
All the clownfish around the island have been genetically tagged. From the small sliver of fin taken from every fish on every anemone by the divers, back in the lab, each individual fish is DNA profiled.
There's probably close to, although it's 300 breeding pairs, there's something like 2,000 fish on the island. We don't know them all by name, but we know them by their DNA because we've been DNA fingerprinting every single individual on this island over the years, so we have a good idea of the identity of everyone. And you know, what we're trying to do is we're really trying to understand how this population on this isolated island sustains itself.
So when a new fish arrives on an anemone, the scientists can tell accurately where it came from, and the result has intrigued them.
What we've found to our surprise is a large proportion of the juveniles have actually come back to the, so this is their home island. When the little eggs hatch, the larvae breed, they go out here into the open ocean for 10 to 12 days, and somehow they're making their way back to this island in that time.
This is something no one had ever anticipated. Baby clownfish actually come home. Instead of drifting in the plankton, and eventually by chance landing on an anemone a long way from their homes, these tiny fish are battling against the currents to swim back to the reef on which they hatched. This is an astonishing finding, that tiny, newly hatched fish have a homing sense. They're not coming back to exactly the anemone where their parents are. This ensures that when a juvenile fish settles on an anemone, it will not end up breeding within its own gene pool. But they are coming back to an anemone very close nearby. Discovering the answer to one question raises yet another mystery to be solved. In the vast open ocean, how do young clownfish find the way back home? While the James Cook team grapple with this latest twist in the tale, 3,000 miles from Kimby Bay, the practical applications of the results of Vorotep's many years of research are bearing fruit in a way he hopes will help to save clownfish in the wild. In the villages around the university, a number of fish farms have grown up under his guidance, and he's been happy to share with them the knowledge that his research has provided.
Okay, after we already do research and we set up what we call demonstration farms. This one is very important because the farmers can come and to see and to practice or training in our farm.
This area of Thailand has long been associated with fish farming, tiger prawns being the region's biggest product. But the success of the film, coupled with the assistance offered by Vorotep's team at the university, has resulted in some of these farms switching solely to cultivating anemone fish. The farmers have had the advantage of visiting the university's demonstration farms and receiving a full induction in the techniques.
Okay, and later on, they can go and make decision that they want to do the farming of the fish or not later on. If they want, we can go further by follow them to their farms and help them to establish their farms to make sure that they have success in the technology that we already transferred to them.
And this is perhaps the most successful. This is actually called Nemo Farm. At peak production, the farm can turn out up to 10,000 fish a month to supply the international aquarium trade. It's fish farming on an industrial scale. The farm owner Promote has been in business for 4 years, business triggered solely by the movie. These are the breeding tanks. Each of these tanks is partitioned and contains 2 breeding pairs of clownfish that spawn as often as once every 2 weeks. These breeding pairs are the farmer's stock, and during their life, a pair of fish may produce many crops of young. The juvenile fish are then kept in a series of growing tanks until they reach marketable size, when, like the wild-caught fish in Papua New Guinea, they'll be shipped to the markets of Asia and the United States. Many species of fish in the wild group together for protection. But not the anemone fish. They live in small, compact groups and are extremely defensive, driving off any other fish that tries to invade their space. In tanks, they show totally unnatural behavior to that they would exhibit on the reef. With no anemone to shelter them, they behave instead like schooling fish, forming a tight shoal as defense for the individual. Promote receives a farm gate price of $1.50 per fish. The same fish will sell for at least $25 in the States within just a few days. There's a lot of money to be made from the aquarium trade. Promote learnt all he knows about fish farming from Vorotep, and they still work very closely together, Vorotep regularly visiting the farm to see how his theories are put into practice. For Vorotep, captive breeding programs such as the operation at Nemo Farm could be the salvation of the species in the wild. He strongly believes that taking live fish from the reef is disruptive and ultimately damaging. But not everyone thinks the same. Visit any pet market in any Asian town or city, and the often illegal trade in wild animals is blatant and also profitable. Just about anything can be bought in the narrow warren of streets that make up Bangkok's pet market. And among the stores are dozens specializing in the sale of tropical fish. Despite conservation laws, wild-caught fish, some already increasingly scarce, can be bought here. No questions are asked, but the traders are very defensive about their business. Most refuse to let us film in their stalls and shops. Eventually, we got access to one fish store where a father was buying fish for his children's home aquarium. Like kids the world over, all they wanted were characters from the film. Finn the Moorish idol, and an anemone fish to play the part of Nemo. These fish will spend the rest of their lives a very long way from their homes on the reef.
I think that the impact of the movie is increase the number of the people who want to have the Nemo in their tanks, and that have a lot of pressure on the wife, on the coral reefs, because they have to catch more fish from the coral reef. So I do believe that our work, our research, can save Nemo in the wild.
The James Cook team have been grappling with their latest conundrum. The discovery that a large proportion of the juveniles born on a particular reef are actually coming back to the same reef amazed ocean scientists and opened a Pandora's box of further questions to be answered.
I guess one of the things that's interested us is just how do they do that? This is a small island in a big ocean, tiny little creatures. How are they making their way here? And
by testing the reactions of fish in laboratory conditions to varying sensory stimuli, Jeff's colleague Phil has discovered the answer.
So amazingly, we found that they're using smell, the smell of the reef, to actually find their way home. So they can actually smell the trees that live on the islands that where the reefs are that they like to live. They can smell the anemones that they like to live in, and they can even smell predators and avoid them. And so they've got these tiny little fish have amazing sense of smell, and they can use that to find their way into the reef, to find a good spot to settle and avoid being eaten by a hungry predator while they're doing it.
So how can a fish smell an island?
after many years of research, we think that one of the solutions to that problem is the secret is in the rainforest itself. These trees you'll see are raining leaves down all the time. The island is surrounded by leaves which drift away from the island, and it creates a bit of a scent trail. They can smell these leaves and they can find their way back.
This is an astonishing finding, that tiny, newly hatched fish have such a highly developed sense of smell that they can distinguish between countless confusing scent trails in the sea, identify the specific smell of their home island or reef, and can then swim upstream, battling against the current, until they reach home and settle on an anemone in their parents' neighborhood. This research is important, as understanding the life cycle of the fish is the first step in ensuring their survival, because now, in the 21st century, clownfish face not only natural, but also man-made threats. In many countries, divers use cyanide to stun and capture live coral reef fish. Despite the fact that cyanide fishing is illegal in virtually all Indo-Pacific countries, the high prices paid for live reef fish have spread the use of poison across the entire region. Since the 1960s, more than 1 million kilos of cyanide have been squirted onto reefs in the Philippines alone, and the vast Indonesian archipelago now faces an even greater cyanide problem. Sadly, the most pristine reefs are the primary target for cyanide fishing operations. The scientists are well aware of all the dangers faced by their subjects.
The threats, there are obviously a number of threats to anemone fishers. There are the natural predators that they might encounter, transient trevallies and cods and the like that might be able to eat them. There are also threats now from collecting, from pollution and a range of other issues, but probably the largest threat in my mind is the looming threat of climate change.
Beautiful though these images are, they're actually sick anemones. Global warming is a phenomenon known to us all. In few places are its effects more dramatic than under the sea. When the water temperature reaches a higher than normal level and stays like that for a while, the anemones expel the symbiotic algae that lives inside them, and so lose their ability to photosynthesize. The loss of these cells is witnessed by bleaching of the anemone, loss of its normal color pigmentation. Some eventually recover when the water temperature drops back to its normal level, though they reduce massively in size. And a proportion die, leaving the anemone fish homeless. And without the protection of the anemone, these fish will inevitably die. So is wild capture the biggest threat to clownfish? Is it the aquarium trade? Or is it global warming and the threat of bleaching to their host anemones? In fact, a more insidious and invisible threat to clownfish in the wild has been discovered, and it's you and I. As increasing amounts of carbon dioxide dissolve in the oceans, it makes them more acidic. Scientists describe this as the pH level decreasing. What the researchers have discovered is that this reduced pH affects the fish's ability to smell. Lab experiments show that as pH reduces, eventually they become so confused that they can't distinguish one smell from another. And so the larval fish lose the ability to find the security of their home reef and wander lost in the ocean until falling prey to predators. The life cycle of the anemone fish that has sustained them forever has been broken. No larvae returning to the reef, no new generation of fish to continue the populations, and no more clownfish. Every time we turn on our car engines or switch on a light at home, a proportion of the carbon dioxide we create is absorbed into the ocean. So you and I are perhaps now the greatest threat that the clownfish faces. The pH level of the ocean has fallen 100 times faster in the last 2 centuries than ever in the previous 650,000 years. If this continues, the film star clownfish might not be coming home for very much longer.